Well, hello, hello, hello. I am excited to join the first day of LudoNarraCon with this great group of people who I imagine are excited with me. Our panel here will talk about narrative systems from pen and paper to video games. I'm your moderator, Soraya Ian Haji. My pronouns are she, her. By day, I'm a senior producer working on the State of Decay series at Undead Labs, and in the past, I've worked in tabletop, free-to-play MMOs, and even YouTube. By night, I'm working on an as-yet untitled narrative game and a social deduction game called Witch Wizard. So let's all introduce ourselves, if you will, please, my beautiful panel, with name, pronouns, and a little bit about our work. Who wants to go next?
I'll do it. Hi, everyone. My name is Inari. Pronouns are she, her. I'm a narrative designer at Ubisoft Ivory Tower, working with the Crew IP. Before that, I used to be a freelance and indie developer as a narrative and game designer. And I've been working with tabletop RPGs for the last 10 years.
All right, flip a coin. Who wants to go next?
I'll go. Hi, I'm Gareth Damier Martin. My pronouns are they, he. I'm a game designer, writer, and artist. I made the game In Other Waters as a mostly solo developer, which has been at LudoNarraCon, I think 3 years running now. But I can cheat because my publisher also runs this thing. And unveiled, as of about 4 hours ago, the prototype of my new game, Project Sidereal, as well. And I'm a kind of a tabletop dabbler, I guess, but not a tabletop maker as of yet.
Hello, my name is Bertien van Heuvel. I live in the Netherlands. I am a freelance game designer and game writer. I work both for independent and AAA companies. I'm currently working on 2 projects: a Lovecraftian horror words visual novel called Eddie's Wake. I'm super good at introducing myself, you can tell. The other project I'm working on is Freight Freedom, which is a personal project, and I'm very excited about it because I'm soon done with the prototype. My RPG experiences are mainly within the live-action role-playing scene. I've been running a Vampire the Masquerade LARP for the last 5 years, almost every month.
Awesome.
Oh, and my pronouns are she, her.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I figure I'm going to start us off with a question that seems simple but can become devilishly complicated, which is basically our whole panel is about pen and paper to video games. So let's define or talk about what does pen and paper mean to us, whether that's by setting a definition or just talking about the potential of it. How would each of you define tabletop games?
Well, tabletop are played on tables. Is it that easy? No, it can be way more. It can be way more complicated. Recently, my last experience was playing Alice is Missing, which is to be played on remote devices mostly. We played it on Discord, and everyone is not talking at all. Everything is done by writing, since the characters are actually typing text messages to each other because one of their friends has went missing. But yeah, for me, tabletop RPGs are mostly a way to walk the line between systems and narrative. In terms of rolling the die means a lot. There's a huge ritual with it, and it's amazing to see how people just wait for that die to end rolling. But actually, the game I spent the most time working on was diceless, and that brought some amazing perspectives as well.
For me, tabletop RPGs are they have a system. They don't necessarily need to have a system, but there's something system based about the way how you're telling stories, because otherwise it's just going to be make believe. What I think is also quite important with the difference between sort of like what I would consider to be tabletop RPGs and what I consider to be more like board games is that tabletop RPGs work with concepts or ideas that are hard to express in a physical space.
I think personally, my kind of, or like the way I define or think about tabletop RPGs maybe kind of comes from a slightly different perspective, because to me it's a very personal kind of thing that sat outside games. I think like I'm relatively recent to kind of running tabletop RPGs as a game master. That's mostly what I do. I barely play them as a player, but run them a lot, and mostly run solo games with just one player and me, because I don't know that many people who like to run RPGs, and I just got into this style of it. But for me, in the beginning, when I was working on In Other Waters, especially, everything in Other Waters is like with all game development, it's very slow, and kind of building narrative is very slow, and it's a long payoff for you as a creator. And when I kind of started to get into tabletop RPGs, what I found super exciting as a GM was this way in which story just emerged rapidly in a session, and narrative emerged, and I could throw ideas like at the wall and just see how the player responded to them, and see how they picked up on them and where they took them, and then immediately have that feedback loop of, oh, I've proposed like this narrative setup, and now you're thinking that you want to push it this way. Okay, that gives me an opportunity to maybe throw this idea in and throw this idea in. And at the end of the session, you've kind of run through a whole arc that would take weeks, if not months, of game design work to like implant the little breadcrumbs, all the time just guessing what the feedback is going to be from the player, all the time just guessing what their choices are going to be, and trying to. So something that was just like, it was like electricity in my veins to like run a tabletop RPG, rather than make a video game. I don't know if that's the experience that you two have also had, or you three.
I think that's actually an excellent thing that you're bringing up, is sort of like that direct feedback that you're getting from players, because that's one of the things that I absolutely love about running both tabletop and live action RPGs, because you can immediately see the results. You're bringing them a storyline, you're giving them ideas, you're creating these set pieces, and you see them immediately interacting with them. And it's sort of like, especially when you're working in like a field where it will take years to get your product to the player, to immediately see that response, that for me is, it's kind of cathartic.
Yeah.
That's actually an amazing point. One of the things that brought me to tabletop RPGs in the first place, initially I wanted to write, but just writing novels, fantasy novels and such. But I ended up thinking about, when you're writing a book, you have the author and you have the reader, and there's just one way the message is going most of the time. And one thing I loved about tabletop RPGs is that first you have to transmit your vision to one person, which is the person reading the book, possibly the dungeon master later, but it can be not just a regular player. But then those players are sharing their own visions with each other of what you described, be it systems or universe, and that creates even bigger universes where everyone can take part in, and that creates emergent, amazing narratives for years.
Yeah, totally. I think that shared like space that you create is so. It has such a richness to it. One of the games I run at the moment is with my little brother. Well, he's not so little anymore, so I probably shouldn't call him my little brother. My younger brother would be fair on him. And it's kind of inspired by the actual play podcast Friends at the Table. We used a game called The Quiet Year, which is like a map making game, to build a setting, and then used the played a Blades in the Dark hack of our own kind of making, that we've just injected a set of Beam Saber rules into recently, because he now has a vehicle and we needed rules for vehicles that were more interesting, and started kind of filling all of this stuff in, basically. And we're the only two people who know this setting, and this setting has like, I don't know, like 8 different alien races, and like loads. It has an entire city, and we've just moved to a new city that's on the same planet. And like, there's something wonderful about the way in which you can both hold that kind of in your mind, and do what you want with it in a way that feels very also very powerful. But that side of it, I know obviously that the talk is about taking the, not just glowing praise of how good it is to play tabletop games and make everybody feel like they should be doing it, but like how that feeds into games. And I think that aspect is really difficult to pull into games. But I think that the kind of the way in which it allows, at least for me, I found the way in which it allows me to test out world building ideas, to test out narrative tricks. In that campaign, I set up a kind of building that had 6 floors, and I had like multiple factions in those floors, and those factions were like all had their own things that they were doing, their own paths they could follow. It was essentially like a Hitman level. You have all these kind of actors doing their own thing, and that was me actively trying out some things that I'd wanted to kind of put in my currently in development game, and I was able to say, oh well, I can just change all the names of all of these ideas, run this with my brother, see how it plays out, and then I can bring what I learned from that back to my game development, and that's where it gets really exciting for me.
Yeah, go ahead, Bertine.
Oh, thank you. I did exactly the same thing for the setting for Fright Freedom. I played it with my friends just to see, like, okay, so how did they interact with the setting? How did they interact with the cultures and kind of like the themes of the setting itself? And I learned a lot about that because my friends are pretty bro gamers. So despite that I'm making kind of like more of a narrative type of game, it was fascinating to sort of see, like, despite that they were bro gamers, what sort of aspects about the setting appeal to them. Please go ahead.
Oh, sorry. In my opinion, tabletop RPGs are an amazing tool to prototype things and also to test player reactions. I know in the book, what is it called? Procedural Storytelling for in-game design. Stephen Lumpkins wrote an article about how he uses Powered by the Apocalypse games to prototype stuff. Because they're so simple to take. You just need 2 6-sided dice in order to test what the player wants to do. And so when you face them with a situation they might encounter in a level, well, you can directly ask, what do you want to do? And they just say, I want to do this. So you just take your notes, and then when you actually go to the building of the level, you can think, yeah, many people wanted to do this, so if I'm not providing them with this solution, there might be something wrong with my design because I offered them the possibility to act this way. So that's a simple trick of how tabletop RPGs can influence our ways of designing.
Yeah, and I
exactly.
Actually, I was going to throw something to you, Bertine, if that's because we had talked about before the panel, we talked about some of the work that you've done with alternate reality games, and you mentioned how alternate reality games have in a lot of ways taken systems from tabletop RPGs and adapted it. So that's such a nice parallel between, like, here's a system, here's a different type of game that has taken those systems and applied them. I'm wondering, like, are there ways that you see this similar sort of space that can be created for video games?
So let me think, so one of the things that we mostly see when RPGs are being adapted to video games is that they're mostly about the direct combat systems. Yeah. And what I particularly learned, and that's something that we already touched on, is that it's especially the way how our level design is being created and the way how we do our narrative design within the plot itself. That's where you learn a lot from tabletop RPGs. Because you have to, for example, if you create point-and-click games, we've had a history of point-and-click games who were very obnoxious, who had solutions that made no sense whatsoever. And if you would have applied these, like if they had playtested this as an RPG, like a tabletop RPG scenario, before they started embedding them into a game, they would have already spotted, like, oh, this is not the way how players would want to interact with this. Likewise, we talk a lot about verbs in games, right? So the verbs, the actions that a player can take during while you're playing a game. And I'm thinking that by exploring some of the spaces within tabletop design, we can probably think about more ways to, to provide different verbs to players to interact with scenarios. And I think like a few of the better examples, well, I mean, one of the best examples lately has been Discolesium, which really sort of like try to get the freedom of tabletop space into the digital space.
Yeah. The thing is, when you mentioned that when we tried to adapt tabletop RPGs and mostly focused on combat systems, in my opinion, it's because the main reference there has been Dungeons and Dragons for 40 years. Even though we had some Call of Cthulhu games which are focused on investigating, the thing is, the Dungeons and Dragons system is made for one thing and one thing only, almost. It's fighting and optimizing your stuff. And it's all right. It's perfect for some people and not for others, but to each their own. No biggie with that. But as we moved further as a field, something happened in the tabletop community that started in the early 2000s, which is the Forge, that started to think about how video games were tabletop RPGs were made and what they can bring to the player. And in my opinion, Discolesium is perfectly in that vibe, like trying to refocus what tabletop RPGs are about. And it's not only fighting. One other example I would have recently is Legend of the Five Rings. The last edition tried to have a complex system to manage politics that is similar, well, not completely dissimilar to the fighting one. And that reminds me of Griftlands, if you've played that game, which is a roguelike in the vibe of Slay the Spire, where you have both the combat system that is driven by cards, but also discussions and rhetorics are using this kind of systems to make you have an alternative on the way you manage the situations.
Totally. I think this this side of it as well is what changed for me when I started playing tabletop games versus kind of thinking of them. I think I always previously thought of RPGs, especially tabletop RPGs, relating specifically to ideas of freedom, and the idea that you have this wide set of choices. And so many RPGs that derive from tabletop games kind of have this idea of freedom. But what I noticed when I started playing and running RPGs was that it's not necessarily freedom as it kind of expands from the player, but it's more that the system is generative of the choices that are created. Like, it's not just, oh, you can do anything. It's that you have a specific system that like generates a certain kind of like narrative escalation or like progression through these different verbs. And so like, again, it goes back to the system. And that's the game that I kind of am teasing today, Project Sidereal, has RPG elements that I can't really talk very much about. But let's say that in my development process, I've been playing about with the ideas of what does it mean to adapt a tabletop RPG in the style of Blades in the Dark, Forged in the Dark, into a video game. What kind of things might be interesting there and what kind of things fail. And what I noticed, the reason that I felt confident doing that is because when I played Blades in the Dark and when I kind of used things like the faction rules, which for people who don't know, Blades in the Dark is you play as a criminal faction with other players, and there are lots of other factions in the city, and they just have two variables for every faction in the city, whether they have a strong or weak hold on their position and their tier, which is their strength. But because of the way the game plays with those variables, it's incredibly generative of narratives where one faction rises to power and then another one comes in and takes over, and the player is constantly affecting those factions through the jobs they do, through the tasks they do, and just through manipulating two variables on each of these entities, you have this like really generative process that is about generating a specific set of stories, not total freedom. I mean, obviously you can at any point say to the GM, you know, oh, I want to do this, but But in reality, what you're going to say is, I want to take this faction on, or I want to, I see there's a gap opening up here in this bit of turf that's held by these two factions, so I'm going to go there. Like, system generates potential spaces for players to play into, and so, like, game systems so rarely create space for you to move into. It's actually like roguelikes and things where you kind of see that idea, and it's not necessarily procedural, but something where, you know, there's a kind of field in front of you, and you can kind of choose where you're going to push and pull. And for me, that's the thing that started to really stick with me as being, this is what I could. Recent tabletop developments and bring into games is just this idea of offering the player a kind of a set of generative options that are going to take them on different narrative paths. They're not actually going to be, I don't need to worry about, is the player going to want to enchant their horse so it can fly and then, like, you know, go to the moon, which is like, yeah, sure, that's what the kind of example people give in tabletop. Actually, that doesn't really happen unless the player is really trying to mess with you, because the player probably wants to do what the system is allowing and probably wants to play in the system, because that's where interesting things happen. And so actually, it's, you know, I think Discolesium is a great example, because it's not, you're a detective and you know, you can be a variety of different things, but the game never forgets that. It never kind of wanders off into, oh, just do what you want. It's like, no, you always have a thing to do. It's about how you do it. It's about the verbs you use. It's about the subtleties of how you do it, you know, your tone and your approach. Yep. So yeah, I think that's where I get, obviously excited, because I'm wandering into a rant, clearly.
You're pointing a few things, right? And I think, well, so first of all, when you're saying like the player is okay with having like a specific, like a setting, and they get kind of like getting into that sort of stuff. So within live action role playing design, you have this whole thing about a magic circle, you know, that you have to introduce, you have to drag. Well, sometimes you have to drag a player into the magic circle, and you have to prepare them sort of like for the game that they're going to experience, because they need to get this context of I'm playing, I don't know, a vampire, and which means that I can't walk around during the day, for example, which is a limitation that they have to buy in. And yeah, they're not going to do anything sort of like strange things in order to derail the game, because then they're sort of like their whole suspension of disbelief goes out of the window. But here's the thing that I find interesting, is that one of the big differences between video games and tabletop RPGs is tabletop RPGs, you play with multiple people. Live action role-playing games, you play with even more people. While video games, you often play with just one person. And therefore, in a lot of narratives within the video game, you are the protagonist. You're the only person that affects change within the game and the game system. And I'm very curious about what's going to happen if you are not the only person who matters within the game space, even when you play a single player game.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, actually. The first talk I ever gave was precisely about that. It was about the role of the hero in literature and pen and papers. It was like almost 10 years ago in a French conference, so don't look it up. You won't find it, probably. It was nice. But yeah, the thing is, I'm looking forward to a game where you're the companion. Well, a good game where you are, because I think there's a game called A Healer Dies Twice, where you play the healer behind a warrior in a dungeon, and you have to heal them, but they're the one making the decisions on how they're going to defeat the enemies in front of them. And I think that's an amazing headspace to be in, because as someone who plays online games, I'm playing support, and I love not being at the center of attention, because you're underestimated most of the time. But as most players want to feel important when they get into games, so forcing them into positions they don't want to be into is something really amazing, in my opinion.
I don't always think that people want to feel important. I think they want to feel that they matter. And I think that's a big difference. Because I can very much see, like in the games that I run, that not everybody feels comfortable with being the first person to go into the action or to be, giving huge speeches in front of like 20 other players or something. But they do want to have the feeling that if they're going to do something and when they're going to do something, then what they do matters.
Yeah, they want agency, which is...
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting about tabletop, so as was mentioned, when we play video games, we're most used to playing alone. We're like the single protagonist. But with some very notable and awesome exceptions that Gareth was talking about at the beginning, most tabletop systems are built with the default assumption that you're going to be one of a member of people who is trying to get something done. And what is it that tabletop games do that enables all of those people with their different play styles to feel like what they're doing matters? And what of that can we bring over to video games?
That's a very tough question because it's tackled on a game basis. Like no game has the same solution to that specific question because it depends a lot on the dynamics that are created by the game systems in themselves. So it's fairly hard to say there's one fits all solution. And it's the same problem in video games. You can't have the same game design reaction to a problem because there's so much going around in general that it's fairly hard to find the perfect solution because you have to manage resources, systems, and technical issues possibly. But thing is, with tabletop RPGs, you can try stuff more easily because it's basically just a set of rules that have lower dependencies on other issues, in my opinion. I think Bertine has something to say.
Oh, I think the closest that you'll get to sort of like the same type of dynamic in a group as well in a tabletop group as you would get like in an online group is multiplayer survival games. I mean, take an example like Valheim. I played it with my friends, and I go off and try to murder woodland creatures, and then I come back and my friend has built this huge tower with all these beautiful decorations. And I think that's the same dynamic because within the tabletop thing, you often have sort of like you have the people who are like, I want to go and punch the dragon. And then there's always another player who's sort of like in the back going like, I just, so this shop that I just set up, is it already making money?
But that points kind of to the same. I mean, I'm not, I'm the lonely GM with one player most of the time. So it's like, maybe I'm not the best fit to answer this, but then in a way like
that makes you a great fit to answer this, because what have you learned from your one player RPG sessions that might be applicable here?
Well, I think it's more that that like it's that same thing of like generative verbs in a way that it like for one player or for 5 players, if there's a possibility of players taking alternate paths or alternate approaches, it kind of like there's something that I love about the way in which skills are handled in tabletop RPGs versus video game RPGs, which is that tabletop RPGs tend to commit to their skills in the sense that if you have like a persuade skill or an engage skill or a intuit skill, like they don't tend to kind of, they create a space then. Each of those skills creates a space that can be inhabited by a player that they can narrativize, because those are just kind of fairly, they can be narrativized in many different ways, but they give a kind of palette, right? That when you set up your playbook for a character, you're kind of trying to match what you have in your brain with a set of skills in a system and trying to think, oh, well, I want to create this person who actually just talks their way out of every situation. And video game RPGs so rarely offered this in like I was recently playing The Outer Worlds, the one that's not...
the Fallout one is Words.
The Fallout one, yeah, Worlds. Okay, The Outer Worlds. And I just like immediately spec'd my character to have the maximum possible persuasion skill, and every time I leveled up, I just put more and more points of persuasion, which basically just meant that I had a get out of free cards for every quest where I would just go and talk to the quest giver or the person who was related to the quest, and I picked the dialogue option that was unlocked by Persuade, and that would, you know, like skip the combat basically. And it's such an impoverished like bit of mechanics versus the, and I'm not blaming it on the developers of that game at all, because I totally understand the type of game they're making, but just in comparison with tabletop, it's so fascinating to watch how you have this entire combat system over on one side, and then on the other side you just have like a thing, a boolean which says, do you have enough persuade here or not? But the weird thing was also is that my character got better and better at combat the more I put Persuade in, because Persuade had this secondary skill that I have like a 50% chance to terrify an enemy when they first encounter me, which is just like, okay, sure. But it's the sense that like even me trying to spec down this path led to me being this like terrifying person who every time I started combat, all of the enemies would start quivering in fear because I was good at persuading. And it's, that in a way is the opposite, because it's railroading the player into a specific set of systems that the game wants you to play. And I understand that's the core. The combat experience is the core experience. It's where the development time's been put. It's where the money's put, and it's where the fun is maybe for a lot of players. And so even if you're like, oh, I'm gonna persuade people, they want to kind of slowly draw you back to that. But I feel strongly that it would be so interesting to try to commit instead to that persuade skill, to try and see if you could build, like, to do an experiment where you could see if I give the player this set of skills, what does that really mean? What does it really mean if I give a player intuition? How can a player complete this game through intuition alone versus through physicality alone? And that's where I kind of feel that there's a big gap between video games and tabletop that I'm interested in experimenting with, and that I'd like to see more people kind of play in, really.
I think when you bring up an example like this, that reminds me that when you're talking about conversation skills within computer RPGs, they're often kind of like, you can see the skill check, like you can see like, oh, if I'm going to pick this option, then I'm going to be persuading these people, right? Which makes it sort of very
artificial.
Yeah, it feels artificial, like mechanically. So I wonder whether the experience would have been better if you had the feeling like you were actually going like, oh, me is a smart person. I see that option. I'm going to pick that option.
Well, there's the other version as well, isn't there? Which is like choosing the correct set of dialogue options, which also doesn't feel.
It doesn't feel correct. But I think
it's like.
I think the best solution is, let's go back to Discolesium, where failure is interesting. And so when players in my tabletops fail a check like a persuasion or something, they expect a funny result. Like they know like, oh, I'm gonna mess this up, but you know what? It's gonna be fun. Yeah. And I think maybe that's how games can move around that issue of the binary choice within these kind of games.
Yeah. I think so. Two things. What Gareth was underlining, in my opinion, was the problem of time compression in traditional tabletop RPGs, because combats take possibly an hour to resolve in real life, but it just spans over a few seconds to minutes in most tabletop RPGs. But when you're rolling a die to make a conversation with someone, you're most of the time just rolling it once. So the time compression is completely different. And when we went into video games and started to make very complex combat systems, well, they take so many resources that we just need to have the simple option for the discussions. And in my opinion, the best thing to do at the moment is kind of card-based games for rhetorics, where you have to develop a skill tree about how you can manage your conversation. Like, oh, I'm gonna set a rhetorical trap at that point in the conversation. So basically, important, at least conversations can become like playing chess. You have a set of moves that you can use in talking and just go further with it. A bit like PBTA do actually.
I think that's
Is that Signs of the Sojourner who does a similar thing?
Yeah, a bit.
Yeah.
And Signs of the Sojourner is good as well because it doesn't let you win everything.
Yep.
It's impossible to win everything in that game,
and you're forced to abandon stuff.
And PBTA powered by the apocalypse, just in case anyone is newer to tabletop. No worries.
I think this idea of interesting failure, though, as well, is also the other big thing, apart from this kind of verbs thing between tabletop, at least from my perspective. I guess that maybe comes from someone who's used to playing Blades in the Dark, which is a game that is kind of entirely focused around interesting failure, because the way that game works, for people who don't know, is typically when you roll a dice, you get a consequence. There's you almost never, unless you get a really high result, there will be a consequence to every single action. It's usually you do it, but there's a consequence. Is the pretty much standard thing that happens, and it means there's a lot of pressure on you as a GM to constantly be coming up with consequences that don't screw your players over so that they can't get out of can't like wound them every time they do something. Oh yeah, you're in the sword fight. Yeah, you managed to parry the blow, but you get a little bit cut. Because if you do that 5 times, it's like they've been flayed to ribbons. But the kind of you to think about different kinds of consequences. And then it also has this wonderful mechanic called the Devil's Bargain, where at any dice roll, the player can ask for an extra dice to roll, just for a consequence, just a straight up consequence that will happen no matter what the roll is. And I have so much fun with this when I'm running games, just like setting up things and thinking about consequences in narrative terms, putting other characters under threat, under pressure, putting, knowing where their plan is going, blocks in their plans, or just the classic passive aggressive thing to do in a Blades in the Dark game, which is to tick a clock. Them that a bad thing, like they're closer and closer to this mystery event happening. And all of those, what I love about that system though is all of those tools are exposed to the player. It's not like if I was ticking clocks in behind my GM screen, they would not be interesting at all. I could be doing anything back there. It doesn't, I could be like using a calculator to do averages. It doesn't matter. What's interesting is the player can see the clock and the player can feel the pressure and the player could feel the consequences. And that's where I feel that games could expose narrative systems so much more. And dialogue trees and things like that could be exposed more in order to give that space for the player to say, well, I'm not just choosing what I feel like. I'm not just playing the Commander Shepard that I feel like on today. I feel like nice Commander Shepard today. But instead, I'm like, no, my Commander Shepard is a ruthless son of a bitch. And so if I know that, if you expose the ruthless son of a bitch path to me, I will take it. And that will be satisfying for me because I know what I'm playing with and I know what, you can throw consequences at me from that. And that's where I feel like I would also really like to see that influence come through, is in exposing systems in narrative. Because in combat, we're so used to systems being exposed. But in narrative games, systems are so often hidden from the player and tucked behind the screen.
Like we said, preparing this panel, when you're making a tabletop RPG, you're basically making a narrative engine. So your purpose is to create stories and make them spawn off what happens. So to get back to powered by the apocalypse games, as a DM, you have a limited set of options when the player actually fails a roll or manage to get the in-between solution, because you have to choose between some kind of consequences. And there's a limited set that you can use, and you have to talk with the players possibly to discuss around that. And I think this is amazing, because what the problem we have in most video games is that we work on a binary way. You succeed or you fail. And there's rarely an in-between. Like my most amazing moments in video games are when I just went up to a boss and I end up with 3 HP left. And then I'm like, how am I supposed to get back to the city? And those are in-between situations, because I gave my everything to defeat them and I succeeded. But the danger of losing everything right behind it is great, and that's a liminal moment that I think is amazing, and we would need to see a bit more.
Is that because essentially within video games we always encourage people to win? Like when you're talking about combat, like there's only one result from combat. It's either, well, I mean, there's two. It's either to win or to reload your game so you can try again to win.
Yeah, or flee in some games.
I mean, sometimes, but
let's call it a win. You're not dead.
Yeah, you're not dead. But when you want to introduce an interesting narrative game, you do have to add these options so that people can lose. And I think like when you have both of these things simultaneously in a game, you're going to get the player that won't feel like they're going to be encouraged to play to lose. They're going to be feeling like, oh, I should always try to win. And I think that might also create this situation where when you're playing Commander Shepard, you're going to pick the options that make the other people happy, because the combat is about winning. Therefore, the dialogue system is also about winning, maybe?
Yeah. I think just before we get a bit further, one of the games that have amazing losing resolutions is Pyre by Supergiant Games. No matter whether you win or lose, you have to move forward with the story. And that game just broke my heart so many times. I highly recommend it.
Well, speaking of games that we highly recommend, we are getting close to the end of our time here. So I want to make sure that everyone here has a chance to talk, to kind of wrap things up, talking about projects that they're working on, or, things that just interest you that you recommend people check out. You kind of kicked us off already. So do you want to just take us from there?
Yeah, all right. So as far as tabletop RPGs are concerned, I'm working on a dark fantasy setting with a game that revolves around helping people with their PTSDs in general. I'm consulting psychiatrists to make sure I'm not doing anything bad with them, but I want this game to be a tool for people that might need to talk about stuff that happened to them with the cover of being playing. I want them to feel very safe with it, and that's a project I'm really looking forward to kickstarting.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And Bertine, how about you?
I am looking for the perfect generic RPG system. And
what a nightmare!
I'm going to try out Genesis soon, and I'm very interested. I'm very curious how that's going to work.
All right, we got a little sneak peek with Gareth. You mentioned that you announced your current project this weekend. What are we allowed to hear about that so far?
Yeah, I think if you type sidereal, which is spelled sidereal, into the Steam search bar that's just somewhere near your mouse right now, that you can get to the Project Sidereal page, which is my new game, and you can know that it's in space, and there are hexagons that appear on the teaser trailer, which count from numbers 1 to 6, which might suggest something that we use in tabletop games. Although I don't know now. So few people have mentioned it. I thought it was obvious, but maybe it's not. So it is a game that I can't say much about. We'll be doing a bigger reveal in the summer, but it's definitely inspired by tabletop RPGs and my own experience, kind of learning to be a GM for one-player RPGs and kind of thinking, okay, all these systems, especially Blades in the Dark, just playing Blades in the Dark and being like, this is an amazing storytelling device, and why can't video games be like this? So I'm going to take a shot at making video games more like that. And I don't know if it will work. It's genuinely an experiment into that. So we will see how that goes. But I'm really excited about that, and I'm going to be talking more about that soon.
Awesome.
And if anybody out there is like me, I was 3 years ago, where I had always been curious about tabletop RPGs but never played any, I would strongly recommend listening to any actual play podcasts at all, but especially the actual play podcast Friends at the Table, which is an excellent podcast. And just a great, listening to other people play RPGs is a great way to start to try and like get yourself hooked on RPGs so that you then have to play them. So I'd strongly recommend that.
Absolutely. And we had a really interesting discussion here. I really like the points that folks brought up about how RPGs kind of expose the mechanics of their systems and create so that the players can also play with those systems, and that they create interesting failure. I think there's a lot to think on there. I think we also could have gone on with this brilliant panel. We could have gone on for a couple of hours talking on this subject, but we are at time. So thank you everyone for being part of this panel. Thank you everyone who watched or spoke. And enjoy the rest of LudoNarraCon. It's going to be a great weekend.